The great hall of York Place was buzzing with excitement. It was Shrove Tuesday, March 4th, 1522, and Cardinal Wolsey was hosting a grand feast in honor of King Henry VIII, Queen Catherine, and the visiting ambassadors of the Emperor Charles V. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and the sound of courtiers laughing and chatting. But amidst the opulence and merriment, one person stood out: Mary Boleyn. Mary was a petite, fair-haired beauty, her face framed by a delicate veil. She moved gracefully through the crowd, her eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. She knew that tonight was no ordinary feast. It was a display of power and wealth, a chance for the king to show off his court to the visiting dignitaries. As the feast began, the hall was cleared to make way for a pageant titled The Assault on the Castle of Virtue. A large green-painted model of a castle, Le Château Vert, was wheeled into the center of the hall. The castle had 3 towers, each adorned with banners. One banner showed 3 broken hearts, another a lady's hand holding a man's heart, and the third a lady's hand turning a man's heart. The symbols were intriguing, and Mary couldn't help but wonder what they meant. Just 2 days earlier, on March 2nd, the king had held a tournament in honor of the ambassadors. Henry himself had participated, riding a horse adorned with silver caparisons embroidered with a wounded heart, and the motto, El mon cœur en Navarre, She has wounded my heart. The symbolism was clear. The king was in love, or at least pretending to be. But who was the lady who had wounded his heart? As the pageant began, Mary's thoughts drifted to the king. Henry VIII was a powerful, handsome man, and his presence was unmistakable. He was tall, with auburn hair and a strong, athletic build. His eyes, clear and bright, seemed to search the room, and for a moment they locked with Mary's. She felt a shiver run down her spine. The king's gaze was intense, and she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of excitement and fear. Mary was married to William Carey, a man who was far from insignificant. William was a respected courtier, and he had recently received a royal grant, which many saw as a sign of the king's favor. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that the grant had something to do with her. Was it a reward for her, or a way to keep her husband complacent? As the pageant continued, Mary found herself drawn into the performance. The castle was under attack, and the defenders were fighting to protect their virtue. The symbols on the banners seemed to come to life, and Mary couldn't help but wonder if the king was sending her a message. Was he trying to turn her heart to win her over? The pageant ended, and the hall erupted in applause. King Henry, looking pleased, turned to Mary and smiled. She felt her heart race. The king's attention was a double-edged sword. It could bring her power and influence, but it could also bring scandal and ruin. Mary knew she had to be careful, but the king's gaze was hard to resist. As the feast continued, Mary found herself caught in a web of courtly intrigue. The king's eye was on her, and she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would she become the king's mistress, or would she manage to resist his advances? The answer was far from clear, but one thing was certain: the king's interest in Mary Boleyn was just beginning. In the heart of a grand castle, a magical scene unfolded. 8 beautiful ladies, including Mary Tudor, the French queen, and her companions, Gertrude Blount, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Parker, emerged in stunning white satin gowns. Their dresses were embroidered with delicate Milan point lace and shimmering gold thread. On their heads, they wore colorful silk cauls and lavish, jewel-encrusted bonnets. Each lady had a special name embroidered on her headgear and the satin labels of her gown. Mary Tudor, known for her beauty, led as Beauty. Gertrude Blount stood for honor. Jane Parker, soon to be married to George Boleyn, was Constancy. Anne Boleyn was Perseverance, and Mary Boleyn, the elder of the Boleyn sisters, was Kindness. Below the castle, 8 choristers from the Chapel Royal appeared, disguised as ladies with names like Danger, Disdain, and Jealousy. They were dressed like Indian women in black bonnets. Then 8 lords entered, each wearing a cloak of blue satin and a hat of gold cloth. These lords had noble names like Love, Youth, and Loyalty. One of them, dressed in crimson satin with gold flames, was called Ardent Desire. It was a hint at the king's romantic interest in Mary Boleyn, though he himself was not Ardent Desire. The pageant began with the Indian ladies defending the castle, throwing comfits and rose water at the gallant lords. The lords, in turn, attacked with dates, oranges, and other fruits. Eventually, the lords won, and the ladies surrendered. They were led down to the floor, and the lords danced with them. The whole scene was a clever allegory, suggesting that the king's desire for Mary Boleyn was strong, and that she might have been more moved by it than anyone else. Dancing with the king in front of the queen and the entire court was a thrilling but daunting experience for Mary. The king's interest in her was no secret, and it was clear that the pageant was a way to express his feelings. After the dance, everyone unmasked, and the evening continued with a lavish banquet. Despite the romantic gestures, Mary's relationship with the king was not as simple as it seemed. Some historians suggest that she did not willingly become his mistress. Cardinal Pole, a critic of Henry VIII, claimed that the king violated Mary, implying that she was forced into the relationship. The word violate in those times meant to use force or violence, especially against a woman. Pole's accusation suggests that Mary might have been taken against her will, and that she had little choice in the matter. Another incident supports the idea that Henry VIII could be forceful. In 1537, a man named William Webb accused the king of taking his mistress and keeping her as a concubine. While Webb's reaction suggests that the king's actions were sudden and without regard for the girl's or Webb's feelings, it's possible that the girl was willing. However, the story highlights Henry's disregard for the feelings of others, especially when it came to women he desired. Mary Boleyn's situation was complicated. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a wealthy and influential man, and his career was already successful before Mary became the king's mistress. He had served the king for many years, and was known for his diplomatic skills. The honors and positions he received, such as being a Knight of the Garter and a Privy Councillor, were well-deserved and not solely because of Mary's affair with the king. However, it's likely that Sir Thomas and his family saw Mary's relationship with the king as an opportunity to gain even more favor and rewards. They might have encouraged Mary to comply with the king's wishes, knowing the benefits it could bring. This raises questions about the morality of their actions, but it was a common practice in the Tudor court to use any means to advance one's position. The Boleyn family's rise continued when the king became interested in Mary's younger sister, Anne. Anne was more ambitious and held out for marriage, which led to a series of events that would change the course of English history. Sir Thomas Boleyn, always looking to benefit, likely saw Anne's relationship with the king as another chance to gain more power and wealth. In the end, the Boleyn family's story is a mix of ambition, loyalty, and the complex dynamics of court life. Mary's role in it all was just one chapter in a larger, often dark, and always fascinating tale. Mary Boleyn's life as a royal mistress gives us a peek into the world of Renaissance courts, where the rules about how men and women should behave were very different. Back then, the church had a big say in what was right and wrong when it came to love and marriage. The church taught that sex should only happen within marriage, and that its main purpose was to have children. Any other kind of sexual activity, even between married people, was seen as sinful. Mary's story shows us how these rules were often ignored, especially by powerful men like King Henry VIII. When Henry took an interest in Mary, it wasn't just about love. It was also about power and politics. Mary's family, the Boleyns, were ambitious and wanted to rise in the royal court. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a smart and ambitious man who knew how to navigate the tricky world of court politics. He wanted his daughters to make good marriages, but he didn't seem to push them into rich or titled matches when they were young. This might seem strange, but it could be because he had bigger plans for them. Mary's relationship with King Henry VIII was a secret, and it's hard to know exactly what her father and husband William Carey knew about it. Some people think that Sir Thomas and William might have known and even encouraged the affair, because it could bring them favors and rewards from the king. However, there's not much solid evidence to prove this. What we do know is that William Carey received several grants and positions from the king, but these could have been given for his own service and loyalty, not because of Mary's affair. Mary's older sister, Anne, was also involved in the king's life, but in a different way. Anne was more ambitious and wanted to become queen. She used her influence to gain support from powerful people at court, including her brother-in-law, William Carey. This shows that William was important in his own right, and not just because of his wife's relationship with the king. The secret nature of Mary's affair with Henry VIII means that we can't be sure if William Carey knew about it. If he did, he might have been careful not to say anything because challenging the king could be dangerous. But it's also possible that he didn't know, given how discreet Henry was about his affairs. Either way, William's rise in the court shows that he was a capable and trusted man, and not just a pawn in the Boleyn family's plans. Mary's experiences as a royal mistress highlight the double standards of the time. Men like Henry VIII could have affairs without much consequence, while women like Mary could face serious social and personal repercussions. Despite this, Mary's story is a reminder of the complex and often hidden dynamics of power and relationships in the Tudor court. In the early 1500s, the idea of having children outside of marriage was frowned upon, especially by the church. But despite these strict rules, people found ways to prevent pregnancy. Some methods were based on superstitions, like drinking sheep or hare urine, while others were more practical, like using a sponge soaked in vinegar or coitus interruptus. Condoms, as we know them today, didn't exist until much later. During this time, the church and the law had a lot to say about what was right and wrong in the bedroom. Things like masturbation, prostitution, oral sex, homosexuality, and bestiality were all forbidden. Adultery was considered a serious sin and could lead to harsh punishments. For example, in 1483, Elizabeth Shore, the mistress of King Edward IV, was forced to do public penance, dressed only in a sheet, for her so-called sins. However, there was often a difference between what the church said and what people actually did. Men of high rank, like kings and nobles, were expected to have affairs with women of lower status. This was seen as a way to avoid trouble that might come from having affairs with women of their own class. Women, on the other hand, were expected to be virtuous and chaste, especially if they came from noble families. If a woman from a good family was caught being unfaithful, it was considered a big scandal. Henry VIII, despite his strict moral stance, was known to have affairs. In 1522, he began a relationship with Mary Boleyn, a beautiful and well-connected lady-in-waiting. Mary was already married to William Carey, but that didn't stop the king from pursuing her. Their affair was kept very secret, and there is little evidence that anyone outside a small circle of people knew about it. Unlike some of Henry's other mistresses, Mary didn't gain much attention or notoriety for her relationship with the king. At the time, Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, was getting older and had not given him a male heir. This put a strain on their marriage, and Henry started looking elsewhere for companionship. Mary Boleyn was probably one of the women who caught his eye during this period. However, the affair didn't last long, and by 1525, Henry's attention had shifted to Mary's younger sister, Anne Boleyn. Mary's relationship with Henry was different from that of his other mistresses. While some, like Elizabeth Blount, gained financial rewards and even had children with the king, Mary's affair was more discreet. She didn't receive the same level of attention or benefit, and her reputation wasn't as damaged as some might think. In fact, there is no evidence that Mary's affair with Henry caused a public scandal, or that it was widely known at the time. After her affair with Henry, Mary seemed to fade into the background. Her younger sister, Anne, quickly became the star of the court, known for her beauty, charm, and fashion sense. Anne's rise to prominence would eventually lead to her becoming Henry's second wife, but that's a story for another time. The secrecy surrounding Henry and Mary's affair meant that there were no public records or accounts of where they met. Some have suggested that Henry might have visited Mary at her family home, Hever Castle, or at other properties like Penshurst Place. However, there is no concrete evidence to support these claims. More likely, their meetings took place in secret at the royal court, where Mary was often present as a lady-in-waiting. Despite the secrecy, the affair did have some consequences. Mary's reputation was later tarnished by rumors and stories, but these were often exaggerated. In reality, her relationship with Henry was brief and relatively quiet. The real impact of their affair would only become apparent years later, when Henry's desire for Anne Boleyn would change the course of English history. Mary Boleyn's story is one of contrasts. While her sister Anne became the center of courtly life, Mary remained in the shadows. She was not the kind of woman who sought power or influence. She was content with a quieter life, even if it meant being overlooked. Her affair with King Henry VIII, though brief, left a lasting impact on her and her family, but it didn't change who she was at her core. Mary's relationship with Henry was likely driven by the king's desires rather than her own ambitions. Unlike Anne, who held out for marriage and a crown, Mary did not seem to demand much from Henry. She didn't receive lavish gifts or titles, and her husband, William Carey, remained a relatively minor figure at court. This suggests that Mary was not using her position as the king's mistress to gain wealth or status for herself or her family. Despite the lack of material rewards, Mary's affair with Henry was not entirely without benefit. She used her connection to the king to help secure a position for Thomas Gardiner, one of Henry's chaplains, as Prior of Tynemouth. This act of patronage, while small, showed that she could still wield some influence, even if it was limited. After her affair with Henry ended, Mary's life took a different path. She faced challenges, including financial difficulties after her husband's death, but she managed to navigate these with resilience. Her relationship with her family, particularly her father, Thomas Boleyn, became strained, and she was seen as something of a pariah. However, she eventually found stability and a measure of contentment in her second marriage to William Stafford, a soldier of modest means. Mary's legacy is often overshadowed by her sister Anne's dramatic rise and fall. Anne's ambition and charisma made her a central figure in the political and religious upheavals of the time, while Mary's more reserved nature kept her on the sidelines. Yet, in her own way, Mary's life was just as significant. Her choices, whether deliberate or not, allowed her to avoid the pitfalls that ensnared her sister and many others at court. In the end, Mary Boleyn's story is a reminder that sometimes the quiet and steady path can lead to a more fulfilling life. Her ability to endure and find happiness, despite the challenges she faced, is a testament to her strength and resilience. While she may not have been a powerful figure at court, she lived a life that was true to herself, and that, perhaps, is the most important legacy of all.